So with regard to today's topic, there's a quote that I've always remembered since my graduate school days by Erwin Schrödinger, the famous physicist, back in the 19 roughly 20s to 50s, who said, in the final analysis, if you can't tell people what you've been doing, your doing is for nothing. And so it's not just a matter of telling people what you've been doing, but you have to do it in a way that they can understand. And so it's not just a question of scientific literacy, which is all the rage these days, but also scientific communication. How do we get our ideas across to people in the most effective way possible? And so we've asked Ashley, who does this professionally, studies this in the College of Media and Communication, to come and talk to us today. So her title is Engaging in Effective Science Communication. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you. So like I was telling some of you before the talk started today, this talk was one thing, and then I went to a conference and it started changing a bit. So some of the topics I want to talk to have sort of creeped into this. One of which is, so I'll ask you, how many of you are engaging with the public directly and talking to the public about your research? Okay, handful of you. How many of you have talked to science journalists who have then written about your work and then presented it to the general public? Okay, also some of us? Okay, so many scientists or people who are doing research will think, well, okay, so I understand that we're all supposed to be good science communicators and that it's important to be able to write or to talk about our research in a way that's great for general public, but they're science journalists, right? That's what their job is. Over there in the media and communication school, they're supposed to be training journalists to do this sort of science communication thing. Well, I found out, unfortunately, that is not true and had my heart broken at a conference that I went to. So it was at the Association for Education in Journalism and Journalism and Mass Communication. And it's an interesting, I guess, much like education, right? Our College of Media and Communication has professors who are teaching what will probably be future journalists as well as future advertising and PR people, etc. But the faculty themselves aren't professionals in this area. We do research about how to most effectively do this, or what maybe the societal impacts are from this sort of thing. PR and ad, you may see a lot of faculty members studying why PR and ad can be detrimental to society as well as why it's beneficial. So we are in this room and there was a panel of 4 science journalists, and they were supposed to be talking about, journalism in the age of Trump and credibility, et cetera. And then so to a room full of people who are studying science, risk, health, and environmental communication. So when they were done, they asked if there were any questions. I raised my hand and I said, okay, I recognize that in disciplines in which there's a profession, and then there's the people that study that profession, like education, like journalism, we're not always great about making sure that you all know about our research and that we know what it's like to be on the ground. So what can we do to help you be able to know how to better communicate science? Like, how can we give you our research? And they looked at each other and they said, I don't think that's our responsibility. And they're like, can you be a bit more clear? And I said, okay, well, for example, we had done a research study where we found that if we wanted to communicate about the public health consequences of the Zika virus, if we framed that by also including information about how Zika is going to get worse with climate change, or how Zika is going to get worse from immigration, and we can go into why those things are, as opposed to just presenting the public health story, we end up polarizing an issue that is not currently polarized within the public at all, right? We know the public is polarized on climate science. We have people who accept it, people who don't. Immigration, people are polarized on whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. But Zika is not currently polarized, and we made it that way. So when liberals read about Zika being caused by immigration, they were then answering the survey saying, well, I'm not sure that it's that big of a deal, and I don't know that I believe it causes microcephaly. When conservatives read about Zika being caused by climate change, they were like, well, I'm not sure if that's a big deal, and I don't think that it actually causes microcephaly. So we were polarizing an issue that wasn't already polarized.
So we were like, please, 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 science journalists, when you're covering issues like Zika, please don't then, try to add in that component of climate change or immigration, because it's just going to muddle up what the actual goal is, what the actual story is. And again, they looked at me and they were like, well, I think that your study is interesting and I would probably cover it, but if Zika is really caused by climate change, I'm not going to coddle conservatives and not tell them that that's actually a problem. We need to tell the truth. So they completely missed our point. And so one of our concerns is, and many of us sort of left this room, kind of shaking in a zombie-like state going, well, what are we doing? If not to try to help people communicate about science in a way that actually helps the public get the message, as opposed to creating more division. We realize that where we really need to put our focus is in helping scientists become advocates for their own work. It is our responsibility as the people doing the research to be able to go out into the public and say, this is what we're doing and this is why it's important. So that's part of the talk that's going to be creeping in through here. But in general, when we talk about science communication, and even as the sort of the on hold title for this talk is dumbing it down, we often think about how as scientists it's very difficult to try to take something that's complex and complicated and has a lot of jargon and take it from like geek to plain speak, right? How do we make it understandable to a broad audience? And so we always want to go to workshop and talks where people can tell us how to do that. But the thing is that people can't exactly always tell us how to do that because, well, and I'll get there in a second. Yeah, okay, more commercials. Yeah, okay. But there's a lot of different challenges to science communication. Yes, a big one is trying to simplify your work without misleading the public, and that can be really complicated. But also being better at highlighting the relevance of your research. So for those of you in here who are biologists, right, you know that if you're working on a model organism and you're studying something that's a much more basic level of research than somebody who's studying cancer. Like, it's very clear to Congress, to the academies, to funders why people want to study cancer. So we can cure it, right? But my fiance, he's an ant biologist and he studies the complexity of social organisms, and he's always trying to figure out ways to communicate why his work is important. He starts talking about things like, well, queen ants live 30 times younger than the other ants that only live 10 years, so maybe we can learn more about longevity. But we really need to find out, what is it about our research that can get the public to care about it? And that's really important. I'll talk about that more in a minute. We also often have to deal with negotiating public values. We have to know when we're going to step into something, or when something can be framed in a certain way about our work that will turn it into a controversy. And I will show some images of that just here in a second. Then also the difficulty of communicating uncertainty. The same thing is true for communicating science. We're still trying to figure out what the best way to do this is. We are on the forefront of this knowledge, trying to carve it out, figure out what the answers are. And when I teach the Science of Science Communication class to graduate students, and I'm saying, well, we're working on it, we're trying to figure it out, my evaluations at the end of the semester are always, it would have been really helpful if you would have just given, at some point, a list of things that we should do to communicate science better. We're trying to figure it out. We're not there yet, right? We're still working on it. And trying to explain that uncertainty to audiences can be really difficult. And I think that John Oliver video, if you guys haven't seen it, where he talks about science communication and science journalism, was really good at describing some of that. But again, I guess I took away the slide where I bolded the highlights relevance. I'm going to kind of focus on that for just a second here, highlighting relevance. So, Marcia McNutt, who's the president of the National Academy of Sciences, she keeps saying the benefits from science unfolding across every aspect of society were made possible by sustained investment in basic research. Even greater discoveries will emerge in the years ahead if America sustains and strengthens, not weakens, its support for science. Again, communicating the relevance of your research effectively, not only to science journalists, but also to your undergraduate students who are a voting demographic, right? And even talking to the, I forget what they're called, not the Congress people themselves, but their staffers. The Congress staffers, talk to them about the importance of your research. Take that time to go meet with them. And that can actually, really help sort of get those who are decision makers or maybe have more power to help continue to allow funding to go into topics like the basic science. For those of you who are doing social science research, education, economics, psychology, communication, the government is really considering cutting the SEBS from the NSF, the social, economic, and other science. I forget exactly what it stands for. Half the time I go to the education and human resource management one because they'll still fund that one, but they want to get rid of our social science funding because they have a hard time understanding what the purpose of it is. And so we need to do a better job at communicating that. More reasons, right? So how many of you are familiar with the former representative of Oklahoma, Tom Coburn, right? Who had his waste book where he talked about research that he couldn't believe that we spent money on, most famously shrimp on a treadmill, right? So the purpose of this study was actually really interesting, and it was more of like one that had agriculture and life sciences outcomes and effects from it. They were studying the impact of pollution on the sort of on the metabolism systems of the fish and wildlife in these areas, and so they were trying to figure out a way to stress the metabolism and stress the system of these animals, and so he invented this little treadmill. It didn't even cost that much money at all. This was not an expensive part of the project, but he talked about this as if the NSF was spending, billions of dollars to make treadmill for shrimp. And now, if you're a member of the general public, you're like, what are they doing? Are they just trying to keep themselves, employed here, right? So we have to be better about communicating that, and we can blame Congress people and say that politicians continue to reduce individual research projects to character, and say that that's not our fault, that's the politicians' fault. But it really is our responsibility. Nobody else is going to do this for us. We need to be the advocates for our own research. So on that, and this is really more for some of the STEM. So earlier we were talking about having to communicate what our research looks like to other people, and know that in communication, as well as in education, as well as in psychology, we are doing evidence-based research just like in the bench sciences, and there is a science of science communication. We are studying and trying to figure out how this works using principles from political science and psychology. This is also a plug for our Oxford handbook, which is really useful. This is sort of the first one, which talks more about some of the psychological processes involved, as well as some of the issues. And we're hoping that the next installment that comes out will have more information about best practices for how to do this. But again, we're still working on that. So what I'm going to talk about today are some tips for science communication, as best as I can give you right now, that we published in Trends in Biotechnology as a response to another article I actually know Stefan Blanc, where we talk a lot about genetically modified organisms, but one of the things that he wrote about, so again, this is almost like scientists mansplaining communication to communication scholars, but so they wrote an article. You had a philosopher and two agricultural biotechnologists say, this is how you should communicate about GMOs, and that is a really important thing to know how to do. But one of the things that they wrote about was, all we have to do, our central message, is that genetic engineering is a genetic improvement method, or rather a set of methods, nothing more, nothing less. You don't have to be worried about it. It's just a method we use, right? That is not going to make people feel better. And I'll tell you about why in a second. So here's my sort of 5 principles laid out, and then I'm going to go into more detail. First is we have to move beyond the deficit model. We have to understand our audience's starting points. We have to identify shared values that we have. We should be careful of us versus them debates that we might get boxed into, not only in person, but also in articles. And then we need to recognize the boundaries of our own expertise. When are we providing information as concerned citizens or other stakeholders? And when are we actually providing information that we know because we are experts in that area? So the first one, and this assumption, is made by, I mean, this is a reasonable assumption to make, but the idea is that effective science communication is just about explaining your science better. If your audience just knew the facts, then if you were good at communicating the facts, then your audience would know the facts and then they'd accept the facts, right? No, not at all. Not even Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson can fix this problem, and this was right after he had that show, Bill Nye Saves the World. So the deficit model, so we call move beyond the deficit model. This is the idea that the public has a deficit when it comes to science knowledge. They just don't understand. So the more that they know about science, or even that specific type of science, the more likely they are to accept the conclusions that are offered by science. So here, this would be what it would look like, presumably, if climate science, like the probability of accepting that climate change is real and is human caused with increasing science literacy. So again, this is a hypothesis, right? Now we kind of see something that looks like this, right? There's a little bit of a tilt here. The more science literacy we see, the more, and of course you have plenty of people publishing articles, you know, P is less than 0.05, more science knowledge equals more acceptance. But what's the strongest predictor of climate change attitudes here in the US?
Geographic location, where they live.
Close. It's political ideology,
Politics,
right?
that's
I mean, yeah, so if you ask people this, like,
Yeah, you're like, oh, there's lots of water.
oh yeah, no, there's tons of stuff. The strongest one's political ideology. So if we take the same data and we divide people by whether or not they say they vote for a Democrat or Republican, this is what happens. It's insane, right? So we can say, okay, yeah, that's not the whole picture, right? So in fact, the more knowledge that Republicans have about, and this is science literacy, but this is true if we put education here, it's true if we put specific knowledge about climate science here, the more likely they are to reject climate change, even if we see the actual knowledge. Yes?
Is it okay to ask questions while we're?
Yes, no, go ahead. Here's longer.
If you did this for scientists, Democrats and Republican scientists, would you see a similar?
No, and I don't talk about that in this presentation, but we find that people who are really high on science curiosity tend to use that as their sort of identity or their value system
Not
through which they
political
interpret. Right, and so there's a caveat here. If you have a different identity hat that is relevant, then, you know, just like, so I might say, well, I tend to sway liberal on things, but there's a lot of things I don't agree with my liberal friends when they're going against science, right? So maybe I wear my science hat in those situations. My friends that are conservative in academia tend to believe that climate change is real and human caused, even if their Republican co-patriots don't. And again, that has to do with which value system or which identity that you're seated in. But yeah, so we see that the more that people tend to know about it, the more likely they are to reject it among the national public. So we can see something similar with evolution, although the effect for the knowledge deficit is a little bit stronger in this one. So the more that you know about evolution, the more likely you are to accept it. But again, when we divide it by religiosity, which is the values filter that's important here, we see people split again. So those who are above average on religiosity are maybe a little bit more likely to accept evolution than people who are lower on understanding, but they're still, you know, very, very low on the scale compared to the other groups. So the knowledge helps acceptance when there's no reason ideologically or based on your identity for you to reject that information. You know, because the more knowledge you have, the more you know what position you're supposed to hold in some sense. And so this is one of those little videos from Katherine Hayhoe's work. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to show the video, but that's okay. So she has this video where she's talking about just giving facts to people based on climate change. Oh well. And basically, the more data that you throw at people, in some cases, the more pushback you actually get from them. And when they do have more knowledge, then what they end up doing with that knowledge, that critical reasoning ability, is being more effective at justifying their own position as opposed to changing their minds. So that was sort of the deficit model. If we just focus on knowledge, then we're still going to have a lot left to do. Another point that I was making earlier was understanding your audience's starting points. And I'm going to use GMO as my example here. So what do they know? Well, like my friend's article had said and had written about, all we have to do is explain to them that, well, you have conventional breeding, right? Which, you're mixing sort of two genomes together and you're getting a bit more of a mixed bag here, but when we do genetic engineering, it's very similar, but we can be more specific with it. See, that's so easy, that's so nice. But, it's interesting, when we ask the American public if they've ever eaten a crossbred fruit or vegetable, they tell us like 40% say, only 40% say that they actually have done this before. 60% of the public go, no, I haven't ever eaten a crossbred. Guess what? You all have, right? Everybody's done it. And everybody in here has also eaten GMOs, whether you know you have or not, right? But they don't know that. And in fact, other evidence has said, other surveys have said that when asked, 90% of people surveyed in a nationally representative population said they would want labels on their food telling them if their food contains DNA or not. So when you hear, well, 90% of people tell you that they want GMOs labeled, well, 90% will tell you they want anything labeled on their food if they think that that's in their food. So the general public doesn't necessarily have the same knowledge set, and it doesn't mean that they're dumber or that they don't know anything. It just means that they're focused on learning about whatever it is in their sphere that they have to focus on, whatever type of job or their kids or their family, whatever, and they're not paying attention. Also, side point, there's also a disturbingly high percentage of Americans that think that Alaska is an island. I mean, and in part, you can think about it, well, how do we look at it on a map, right? Now, they don't think Alaska's down by Hawaii. They recognize that it's separate, but they never see it connected to their data. So when you say, I can drive to Alaska, they're like, what? Really? Like, I mean, you don't want to, but you could. Like, that's, yeah. They're surprised. What do they fear, right? You need to know what their fears are. If you just dismiss what it is that your audience thinks is scary, then you're not going to be addressing their issue at all. If you're like, if people's concerns about genetic engineering are that the corporations are sort of finding ways to poison us with different types of chemicals that they're putting into the food to change it in ways that help them make more money, then telling them, oh, don't worry, it's just an improvement method, is not going to address what the concern is. It's like you're arguing about two completely different things. So you need to know what their concerns are.
Ashley, I've got a question along
Yes.
these lines. So you have Monsanto here, and there was talk about, Bayer Crop buying out Monsanto.
Yeah.
And then now BASF has bought out Bayer Crop. So does moving from one corporation name to another, does that impact at all?
It
Notice
can.
poisoning?
No, it definitely can. And in part, it depends on whether or not that company that's buying it out is known or has credibility. If people who are paying attention to the issue and are concerned about Monsanto and think Monsanto's the devil, if Bayer buys it, Bayer's likely to inherit that same sort of negativity. The general public who has a negative reaction when you say Monsanto, but isn't like, extremely dedicated to following the story and, writing angry tweets at the national academies when they do their genetic engineering crop report, they're not going to notice. So they won't hear Monsanto, now they're going to hear some other name, and they won't have that same sort of negative reaction to it. But like I said, some people are going to follow that out, and that they'll inherit that negative reputation. For climate change, so when it comes to GMOs, we have fear of the unnatural, we have fear of corporations taking over. For climate change, it's interesting because it's almost different. For climate change, the fear that we found in the surveys is the fear of the solutions more than the fear of the impacts. People in the US don't, unless you're living on a coast like Florida, may fear that they're gonna feel the impacts of climate change more with hurricanes. But particularly people in the middle of the US, they don't feel like they have seen the impacts of climate change yet in their lives. And in fact, sometimes when people communicate about it, they communicate about it in a positive way. Hey, look, it's not gonna be as cold this year as it has been previous years. So your eyeballs won't freeze in Minnesota. You know what I mean? But the solutions are scarier, and the solutions often appeal to people's identity or their political ideology instead. A friend of mine, Aaron McWright at Michigan State University, has studied this from, and I don't expect you to read all this stuff on the slide, but he studied this from a sort of sociological perspective and has tried to trace the history of anti-climate change and anti-environmentalism over time. And what he found was a relationship between the sort of the founding of these conservative think tanks, like the Cato Institute, like the Heartland Institute, and many others, crafting these white papers that are concerned about some of the policies that people want to put forth in for environmental reasons, sort of controlling or clapping down on corporations' abilities to do what they want to do, right? So you're harming capitalism, you're putting too many regulations on. And this has led to a lot of messaging. The other thing that he found, and I wish I had another figure on here, was that when you look at the increasing difference between Republicans and Democrats in Congress and their voting in pro-environmental ways, you see, there was always a difference, but when you hit about 1990, it just goes like this. And one of the things that he had found was that a lot of the rhetoric that had been used towards anti-communism and towards Germany had to be shifted, because you had the fall of the Berlin Wall and you had the integration of Germany again. And so then you started seeing things like, well, environmentalists are like watermelons, right? They're green on the outside, but you slice them open and on the inside they're red, right? Again, talking about communism, not republicanism, I kind of wonder how that would change now. But with that, you saw this shift of the same language that was being used towards, the commies being applied to the hippies and the environmentalists. So here's some quotes too that kind of give you an idea of what people are concerned about. So do you realize I was actually on your side of this issue when I was chairing the Senate Environment Committee and I first heard about this? I thought it must be true until I found out what it would cost. Right? Many evangelicals oppose actions to slow climate change not on a religious basis, but politically, because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. So again, the concerns here are more about their political ideology and their views about capitalism and free markets than it is actually about their religion. And I'll get to that here as well. So with looking and talking about what people know and about what people fear, we also need to think about, well, what it is that people value, right? What are they concerned about in maybe a bit more positive way? And so here's where we have the Pope come out and say, from a conservative sort of Catholic tradition, we have a moral obligation to act to address climate change. And the thought here was that it's interesting, for Catholics, unlike any other religion, Catholics are truly normally distributed in political ideology. And white Catholics are the second group that is least likely to accept climate change, just under white evangelicals. And so they thought, well, here's the Pope coming out and talking about how climate change is a moral obligation and making an argument in his encyclical about how acting to address climate change is consistent with Catholic ideology. But what did you have on this? So one of his arguments was that climate change disproportionately affects the poor. But you saw political officials, for example, who are Catholic, like Jeb Bush, come out and say, well, I hope my bishop back home or my cardinal doesn't get mad at me, but I'm going to leave my pope for religious issues and stick to politics for political issues. But who's the Pope talking to when he's talking about concern for the poor? That we need to give people resources and help them, even if it's at the cost to ourselves. That's not something that's going to appeal to individualism. That's not something that's going to appeal to more conservative economic beliefs. That's going to appeal to liberals. So we wrote an article called Stop Preaching to the Converted, where we show too that it doesn't matter if you are not Catholic, red or blue Catholic here. The more conservative you are, the more likely you were to say that the encyclical made the Pope less credible. So you could be a Catholic and still say that the Pope is not credible on this issue. Now, he's credible on issues relevant to the church, but not on climate change, even though he made the argument that those two things should have been connected in some way. So the other thing is it's really important to identify shared values if you're talking to an audience or you recognize who you're speaking to. So maybe, for example, you could say, hey, I'm a parent too, yay, okay? Or, Where's that one? I fish. Will I hunt? Will I bird? Will I have this? Whatever. Okay, yay, we found something that we can work with each other on. And Katharine Hayhoe has been a really effective climate communicator because she goes to groups that she is a part of too, right? These evangelical churches, and she says, look, we are the same. We have the same belief structures. We have, we value the same things. I'm a parent. My son's my husband is a pastor. We go to church. Like, we have these values. This is something that's important to us because people, particularly in America, don't like to be told from the top what they should and shouldn't believe. They don't like to be patted on the head and said, just accept what I'm saying and don't worry too much about it. And they especially don't like to be told, well, you'd accept it if you just understood, right? Really don't like that. So we need to make sure that we're talking from more of a grassroots movement. Like, this is how we're in the same group, and we as a group should believe this because this is consistent with our views. The last, second to last point here that I want to make is to really be careful of these us versus them debates. Now, this is something where I'm going to start bringing back around that science journalism, where people, now, of course, it depends on what your issue is. If you're a climate science researcher or you do something with evolution, you might find yourself to be invited to these panels where you're put on stage with somebody who believes the exact opposite of you. And now, again, if we look at representativeness in the scientific literature, you can't say that Ken Ham's beliefs are equivalent to what Bill Nye was representing in terms of support for evolution. It creates this sort of misconception that these 2 points are equivalent and that you can choose which one you prefer the most. So this did not do anything for people's beliefs. You all saw this happen, right? In Louisville, or maybe it was in Cincinnati at the Creation Museum when they had the Ken Ham versus Bill Nye debate about whether or not evolution is really a thing. This just made Ken Ham more popular and had more people coming to his museum. It did not actually change anybody's minds about evolution, especially not with Bill Nye. Don't let yourself be put in a situation where you're being up against somebody else. With science journalism, it can be a little bit more difficult. You don't necessarily know what all is going to go into that article. And as I found out from talking to people on the panel, they don't have to give you their article ahead of time to make sure that your science was represented correctly. In fact, how many of you have seen Ancient Aliens on A&E or the History Channel? Yeah, there's always like 2 or 3 credible scientists that were peppered in there talking about something that made sense, but was not actually about ancient aliens or anything like that, but it ends up lending credibility to the whole show and making it seem like what they're saying is actually relevant. So just be selective with who you're going to talk to and what you're going to say, and it doesn't matter if they're going to tell you no, you should still ask. Can I see what you're going to write about my research to make sure that it's represented correctly? And finally, I think that all of us as scientists can be bad at this. We should be careful not to overstep our expertise. We all have expertise in our areas. We are all non-experts in other fields. And people, particularly science journalists and members of the public, will call us up and be like, hey, I heard that you do stuff about science communication. Can you come give a talk about increasing, Hispanic girls' interest in mathematics? And I have to be like, that's out of my wheelhouse. I'd be interested in that. I think it's cool and I would love to go to the talk, but that is truly outside of my area of expertise. And just know that science journalists don't always know who the best person is to talk to. They might think because your expertise sounds similar to somebody else's that you'd be a good person to speak with, but use your knowledge to help direct them to somebody who is a bit more expert on what it is that they're looking for. So there's my tips again, and thank you. Please let me know if you have any questions. Look those up. Yes?
I think you made the point earlier that scientists are good at lists, scientists like process, procedures, stuff like that. So it's not surprising that if you talk to a group of scientists, they're going to say, well, just tell me how to do it. Give me a listing, right?
Right.
And when you get that, what comments, what do you tell them?
I'm trying to give some, points here for things to keep in mind about when you communicate. But, I think number one, it's, try to get out of your head when talking about your work, and stop writing about your work as if you were pulling your results section from a journal article, and start thinking about it as if you're going to talk to your parent or your grandmother about this topic. And I understand, that the difficulty of this is often that we have jargon for a really good reason. We have jargon because jargon is precise. We don't invent words just to be complicated so nobody else can understand them. We invent them because they're specific, right? Something works when you're talking about it with this specific word, and it doesn't work if you use a synonym of it, right? Now you're overgeneralizing. So I think it's unfortunately just something that we're gonna have to navigate. There is no right answer. We have to figure out how to, just for example, the science journalists talked about how when they develop metaphors to try to explain something. So for example, for genetic engineering, people often use word processors to explain it. Well, we want to change all of the ands in your paper to thes. So we're gonna do a control find and we're gonna replace it all. Well, if we think about that metaphor, that might be helpful for getting people to understand what genetic engineering is, but it's also misleading, right? But the thing is, a metaphor is always going to be misleading, right? So what's most helpful is for you to come up with a metaphor that you think is the best case of misleading that you can do, right? Because nothing can be perfect. And then give that metaphor to the journalists to use when they talk about your work, or for you to use when you talk about your work. Because otherwise they're gonna come up with one that you may be less pleased about. But also, to pay attention to what the science communication literature is as much as you can. So go on Pew Research Center and look at public opinion polls relevant to your topic. Almost anything in biology, you guys may have to deal with stuff relevant to evolution. How do you talk about your work in a way that's not gonna freak out audiences? Or sex, right? A friend of mine had a grant for snail reproduction, and it got twisted around and talked about as snail sex in Iowa. So, just try to be cognizant, remember who your audience is, and try to get in their head of it, and communicate to them. And honestly, the best way is practice, right? So practice talking to other people about your work, practice maybe even writing a blog for the general population, but the more comfortable you get writing that way, then the better you're gonna be at talking that way. But there's really no way we can get around it. You're going to be reducing the complexity of your work in a way that misrepresents it to some extent.
So under identified shared values, you were talking about maybe, talking to maybe your grandmother or, a parent or something who not necessarily understand your science. Suppose, as you were saying, and I said to myself, suppose your grandmother, you're a more liberal person, your grandmother's very conservative. So now you don't have really shared values.
Well, there might be something else you value, right? Like your family or each other. So it's not, we often, and I think that as a society, we really do, I think, structure our values now more around our political ideology than we even do our religion. Many religions have political identities. Yes?
Oh, you can keep going.
Okay,
I just have a
have these political identities. And so, but we do share other things, right? So, maybe if you have kids, you can, when you talk to your grandmother, you're like, look, you're a parent, I'm a parent, you know me, you know how I think, would I do X, Y, and Z? Maybe you believe that Hillary Clinton ran Pizzagate, but you wouldn't think I would do it, So, share these shared values, and try to get people to see you. And it's people are more effective at discussing and communicating and moving one another when they have a relationship than when it's some random person who comes into the room. Yes.
Yeah, it's a great presentation. I really enjoyed this. So I wanted to kind of work off this gentleman's comment too around question or part 3, the identifying of shared values. So obviously, and rightly so, we're talking about adults, but I work with children in K-12. So sometimes they don't know what their values are.
Right.
And when it comes to science, unfortunately, they think I'm just this fountainhead of knowledge. But you're also trying to teach them to be critical thinkers, but not skeptics, right? So do you have any thoughts around how to communicate science with younger audiences?
So
given their cognitive deficits, I mean, no offense, but it's just that they're not fully, their frontal lobes aren't fully formed to to do all that kind of critical thinking.
Right, so my PhD is actually developmental psychology.
Awesome.
And I started off by researching how kids think about experts and when they learn to trust and not trust. And some of the things we found, for example, is that kids would much rather ask somebody who's really nice but has no knowledge about dogs whatsoever questions about dogs over somebody who's a dog expert but is mean, right? We also found too that while kids are able to recognize whether the person wearing red or the person wearing blue is giving accurate information, when it comes down to asking them who was best at it, even if the person who was wearing the same color, because we made them wear little vests, the same color vest as they're wearing, even if that person was giving wrong answers the whole time, they were best at it. So I'll tell you that they were giving wrong answers in the moment, but then when I ask you who was better, they pick their teammate. And that's, I think, a metaphor for sort of what we do later. For kids, I think, so kids are tricky because your goal is not just to help the kids understand the science that you're teaching them, but also not angering the parents in the process of what you're talking about them. So, I mean, we're currently studying, we're developing a project right now that looks not at teaching kids science, but teaching them how to value science, with the goal being that as they get older, they will sort of put on that science curiosity hat when approaching scientific information, as opposed to their political identity one, because you know they're going to vary on these issues. So that's all I can say for right now. It's just really, I would hit home more the idea of this is what the process of science is, and this is why science is important, and this is why we trust it as an epistemology, even more so than these are the 5 steps of the hypothesis testing method, and science says that this is an atom, and this is an electron, and this is chemistry and biology, but get them to value science as a way of knowing.
In fact, you can turn them off very much by just saying, oh, these are the 5 steps of the scientific method, because the first word I hear is, this is boring.
Yeah.
Right? And once they say this is boring, they're not listening anymore. But your comment also with regard to what this, your question was also, made me think about peer mentoring.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'll have peer mentors who will run discussion sections. And even though I say almost exactly the same thing, they will say the peer mentor is so much better at explaining, even if they're not explaining exactly
Right.
because they're speaking a common language.
Yeah.
So it's not just shared values; it's also common language too.
No, and that's definitely true, and also common experience too. They feel like they're on
Right.
the same team. Like you're the other side, right? Because you're the teacher, but we're all the students, and we're gonna bind together to do this, and so we definitely see that. Any other questions?
Yes. So you mentioned a little bit about the family. So when children, what is the research, or what is your research, or what does the research suggest around the idea of family habitus when it comes to like science communication? So like, do you find that students are more, let's say, adaptable to this, understanding of science that you're positing to them before they put on the political? But is there any kind of contention with parents where, because what happens at the kitchen table at dinner
Yeah.
time? If parents talk about science, the literature suggests students are more receptive to science. But there's positive and negative habitus, right? You can be talking around the dinner table about the great things about, like evolution, or you could be talking about negative things. And of course, so what are some of those influences around students' understanding?
Right, well, we don't have a ton of work on this yet, or I don't specifically have a ton of work on this yet. All we do know so far from our data is that parents are extremely influential, both in what their kids know about science, as well as the extent to which they believe it. Until they get to about, with girls particularly, middle school. And then the role of the parents sort of drops off, and girls just take a nosedive in their interest of science the minute that they sort of hit puberty. We found that the science curiosity then can predict later acceptance. So we were playing around a bit with the longitudinal, longitudinal study of American youth, which was collected on Gen Xers. So they were in like 7th and I think 7th grade and 10th grade in the early 80s or mid 80s. And they had been collecting data on them, and then even up until as late as 2007 or 2010 even. And so we were able to kind of cobble together a version of our science curiosity scale with questions that they had asked them back in the early 80s. and found that their science curiosity as children was highly predictive of their climate science attitudes and their GMO attitudes as adults. But that those science curiosity scores were highly influenced by what their parents were doing. So in terms of how much that, I imagine that it's highly referential, but we don't have a ton of evidence on that so far.
So as a follow-up on that also, to what extent is there a crystallization of belief in the sense that, as you said in the deficit model, you can talk at people as much as you want and you can provide all of the facts and everything that you want, but you're not really moving them. And to my mind, that sort of almost implies that, let's say you're in a certain camp versus the other, you're not going to move from one camp to the other.
Right.
I mean, even if you say, well, look, I'm a Republican like you and I believe in climate science, or I'm an evangelical like you and I believe in climate science, how much wiggle room is there really? I mean, there doesn't seem to be too much spread in your data.
Honestly, I don't know. I think that that's something that we're still looking at. There are cases at least of people changing their views. The question is, there's probably personality differences there. There's also situational, and it's also this sort of slow drip over time. You can't just give people an article or show them a movie and expect that they're going to change their minds right away. And that's something, of course, that those of us who do experimental research, it's harder for us to show that. But there's a slow drip of having these discussions, talking it out with your family, like meeting different people, finding out different perspectives, and just almost having this space to think about it that could sort of give people the room to then change their views. But again, is that happen predictably? Is it happening with only certain types of people? Are there people who have slightly different personalities? Maybe they're more, if you're using the ocean scale from psychology, are they more open to experience? That's still open for us to try to figure out who's more susceptible here. Because we often talk even with politics about trying to move the middle. We don't worry about the edges, but trying to move the middle. But are those people in the middle different in personality type than those on the edges? And research would say probably. So I think that's still open.